Dracula, Dracula, Dra.
Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I'm doing a couple of Dracula films because why the hell not? Everybody's going to be doing them next month when it's October. So I thought I'd get a head start on the pack and look at two Dracula movies filmed and released 20 years apart. The most recent of them released 30 years ago this year, so let's get started. By the way, I have 5 shots of coffee in this cup, so anything can happen today. Let's start with 1972 and Dracula A.D. 1972, which is one of those movie titles that is going to date within about 12 months of the movie coming out. It seems a self-defeating title in that way, in the same way that Dracula 2000 is. It is one of the later Christopher Lee Hammer Dracula films. He doesn't get a lot of dialogue. You could probably memorize it in about half an hour. It stands out as a bit of an outlier because it was Hammer trying to be hip and groovy while everybody else was doing nudity and gore, and Paul Morrissey and Andy Warhol were making Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula. Hammer decided to play it safe and to keep it in the home counties and give us Christopher Lee's Dracula in what was then the modern day. It's 1972 and a bunch of groovy 20-somethings are hanging around coffee shops and complaining that coffee has gone up to 20p a cup.
We'll all end up back at the coffee bar,
drinking their lousy coffee at 20 pence a cup.
I won't tell you what my cup cost. And they're kind of hanging out. One of them, Johnny, is a bit of a rebel and a bit of an outlaw and a bit of a wrong'un, while the rest of them are kind of generic, kind of middle-class kids. There is a token black woman in the team. She quickly gets dealt with, but not as quickly as the first person who gets dealt with, who is Caroline Munro, in her second Hammer film. The other one she did, I think it may have been she only did 2. And the other one was Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, where she got a little more meat on the bone of her role. Anyway, they're hanging out in this coffee shop, and Johnny, who is the descendant of one of Dracula's minions, because in a pre-credit sequence, we see Peter Cushing's Van Helsing and Dracula fighting on the top of a runaway horse and cart, or a coach, through the forests of, it says Hyde Park, but it doesn't look a lot like Hyde Park. And the carriage crashes. Dracula gets skewered by one of the spokes of the wheel and turns to dust. Meanwhile, his minion gathers some of Dracula's ashes and his signet ring and takes off to go and have babies for 100 years, until 1972, when his descendant Johnny Alucard, and yes, it's the acronym of Dracula, is hanging out with these people just looking for the right group of groovy young things to have a black mass and resurrect the Prince of Darkness. Why he didn't do it in the 1920s or the 1940s during the war, or at any other time in the 100 years, is not really outlined particularly in the narrative. The mythology and abilities and kind of qualities of the Christopher Lee Dracula varied a lot between movies, and this movie is no exception to that. Among the group is Jessica Van Helsing, the descendant of the Peter Cushing Van Helsing who crashed the horse and cart at the start of the movie. And her grandfather, again played by Peter Cushing, is the grandson of the guy on the horse and cart. So there's a lot of kind of descendants in this movie in various ways. She's played by Stephanie Beacham, who people know from a lot of other things, including The Nightcomers, which was the prequel to the 1962 movie The Innocents. And also she turned up as the scientist/love interest to Roy Scheider in Sequest DSV. So Johnny takes the group to a deconsecrated church. He doses them up with a few kind of not from a pharmacy pharmaceuticals, and they have a black mass where he uses the ashes of Dracula in a chalice along with his own blood to resurrect Dracula and pour the blood over the body of Caroline Munro. All the rest of the gang freak out and split, except Caroline Munro's character, who sticks around to provide breakfast for Dracula. By the way, Johnny Alucard is played by Christopher Neame, a character actor who had a fairly long career and a particularly creepy look. And of course, the character himself continued in a number of short stories and novels written by Kim Newman in his Anno Dracula series, including one called Johnny Alucard. Now, the weird thing about this is the movie's kind of interesting before Dracula turns up for the second time. The group go to a posh party in some very rich people's house and basically take the place over. They've got a band there. They've got a whole bunch of licentious and self-medicating hippies, even though it was 5 years after the Summer of Love, come to think of it. And the kind of conservative people who own the house are freaking out, decide to call the cops, and the hippies try to figure out how long it's going to be before the cops show up. It's a nice scene. It's got some interesting music from a band called Stoneground. They were going to get the Faces, but the Faces dropped out. And so it's got that kind of 1970s vibe about it, with people snogging underneath the banquet table and people and guys and women dancing around groovily in miniskirts and hot pants. It was a little after miniskirts. It was kind of in the hot pants era. And Stephanie Beacham's rocking one of those hairstyles that kind of looks like an undercut mullet. And so it's very on point for the style of the time, though it is still a bit old-fashioned. It was directed by a guy called Alan Curtis, who mostly did episodic television series, as a lot of these later Hammer directors did. Hammer could pick them up cheaply, and they were going to do what they were told and get the product out on time, and that's pretty much all that mattered. They really didn't go in much for auteurs. Now, one of the influences on Dracula A.D. in 1972 was the popularity of Count Yorga and Return of Count Yorga. Hammer found out belatedly, and stupidly they didn't pick it up earlier, that vampires in a modern era were playing well to audiences. People didn't necessarily want the 19th century and 18th century Gothic that had been the mainstay of Hammer's output as far as vampires are concerned. And that having something that was very contemporary, kind of Chelsea, Carnaby Street kind of vibe.
Okay, but if we do get to summon up the big daddy with the horns and the tail, he gets to bring his own liquor, his own bird, and his own pot.
It did okay. There wasn't an enormous amount of money in it. This was toward the end of Hammer's productions, when they started to really not be totally clued into the zeitgeist of the 1970s, even though they did do a few things with a little bit of titillation and things like Lust for a Vampire and The Vampire Lovers. They never really tapped into the possibilities of the broadening of censorship restrictions in the 1970s. They really never hooked into that the way they might have, and the way that particularly American exploitation films were doing at the time, which is a bit of a shame. I would have loved Hammer in the 80s. Hammer really could have done some interesting work as special effects got better and as there was more acceptance and embracing of this kind of exploitation cinema as the 70s moved into the 80s. Now, the weird thing is that Christopher Lee isn't on screen a lot, and he had some contractual issues with Hammer at the time. They really didn't give his Dracula a lot to play with in the late 1960s and the 1970s. He was portrayed as more bestial than regal. And I think that was a mistake, because you got Christopher Lee with that wonderful voice and his stature and his look. And to not use it to its best was a real dumb thing. And so he wasn't happy with the scripts, he wasn't happy with the remuneration that he was getting. And even though he and Peter Cushing were friends, and he did a lot of things to help Peter Cushing through the illness and death of his wife, and this movie was made slightly after his wife's death, unfortunately, he really didn't have his heart in Hammer, even though Hammer had staked his heart a number of times. He went off to America and made some bucks there doing things like Disney movies, for instance, and really weird television miniseries in the 1970s, 1980s. And all strength to him, he became an icon. He made the return of Captain Invincible, for instance, here in Australia in 1983. He was underappreciated in his own country and in the genre that made him a star, which is terrible. And he does get a couple of bits of dialogue here where he confronts Johnny Alucard, who insists that Dracula make him a vampire, which he does. Christopher Lee's Dracula gets that moment in this one to be that regal and terrifying king that we know him to be. But is Dracula A.D. 1972 worth watching? I think it is. There's enough interest in the characters, and the young actors playing the group of characters do have a little bit of fun, though the direction is incredibly pedestrian. Alan Curtis's direction was TV level, not cinema level. And I think that's one of the problems with many of the later Hammer films. They really didn't embrace the creativity of directors of photography and of directors as well. Interestingly enough, the director of photography in this movie had an incredibly unfortunate name. His name was Dick Bush. Anybody with that name would have been stirred enormously all through his life. The cinematography looks good, and I think that he managed to get some really nice camera angles out of things. But I kind of like Peter Cushing in this one. I think his wig is first class for a start, and as indeed is Christopher Lee's. But he does that beautiful earnestness with stupidly absurd dialogue that has always been a hallmark of his genre work. He can make the most off-the-planet dialogue sound plausible and important. I've always loved that about Peter Cushing, that earnestness that conveys itself across the screen, and of course his wonderful cheekbones. So yeah, you should watch this movie. Maybe if you're seeing it for the first time, watch a few of the previous ones, get a little bit of a feel for the series, even though there isn't too much apart from Dracula, Transylvania, Van Helsing to link the various Dracula movies that Hammer did, which is a bit of a shame. I think continuity would have been an enormous strength in making this feel more like a series of films than kind of one-offs rushed through the meat grinder factory of Hammer to get a product out there. I think that even though, of course, there were financial limitations and there were poor decisions made, there were opportunities there that were missed, indeed as there were with Amicus. And of course, it's easy to have 20/20 hindsight half a century later. But I think that at the time, it was groovy. I remember seeing it sometime in the 1970s and enjoying it. Though I didn't enjoy it as much as I did more transgressive things like The Wicker Man, for instance. And even things like The Asphyx. But it's a good, honest Christopher Lee Dracula movie. Part of that stable of films from Hammer. And you should check it out. And then we zip pan from 1972 to 1992. And Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Now, it's weird to think that Bram Stoker's Dracula is 10 years closer to Dracula A.D. 1972 than it is to our current day. We also have to remember that Francis Ford Coppola started out in horror films with Dementia 13 back in the early 1960s. So it was a genre with which he was very, very familiar. So Coppola cut his teeth on horror films. He then went on to do a whole bunch of other things, some of which you may have heard of. Like he did a musical about a leprechaun. He did a musical about people falling in love in Las Vegas. And he made a couple of gangster films and a war film or two in between. And his company, America Zoetrope, wasn't doing tremendously well. It needed a bit of a boost, and this movie indeed gave it that boost to keep the company going in the 1990s. And Coppola had a couple of quirks about him when he was making this film. First off, he didn't want to use too many process shots and special effects and the rudimentary kinds of computer effects they had in 1992. He wanted everything practical. He wanted as much as possible to be done in camera. And he sacked the special effects team in charge of the opticals and hired his kid, Roman Coppola.
Welcome to my home.
Apart from these special effects things where he brought Roman Coppola in to do the opticals, he spent an enormous amount of money on the costuming, and in fact the movie won an Oscar for its costuming and also its sound editing and its makeup special effects. So there was a lot of money on the line here, and it was kind of make or break for American Zoetrope, and I think it's a successful movie. Rewatching it in the current age, I enjoyed it a lot more than I enjoyed things like the Frank Langella Dracula from the 1970s, was it 1970s, 1980s, I think late 1970s. And even though it does retain that trope of the romantic Dracula, I think it also gives us a kind of unique vision. More than many of the other films, it sticks to the format of the original 1897 Bram Stoker novel. It's a whole bunch of diaries and notes, and even notes on wax cylinder recordings, which is a format for the original novel. The novel isn't a straightforward narrative. It's basically a whole bunch of the equivalents of emails and voicemails put together to tell a story. And the weakness of that, of course, is you don't get a single viewpoint character during the movie and the novel. You get the viewpoints of a whole bunch of different people, one of whom is Mina Harker, played here by Winona Ryder, and she does the accent kind of okay. Her husband, first fiancé, then husband, Jonathan Harker, unfortunately is played by Keanu Reeves, who does a total Dick Van Dyke on an English accent.
Yes, of course, sir. If I may inquire, what in fact happened to Mr. Renfield in Transylvania?
You can see Keanu struggling to both act and do the accent at the same time. At that stage of his career and at that stage of his arc as an actor, I'm not sure he could walk and chew gum at the same time. But I tuned that out after a while. I actually reviewed this for ABC Radio a couple of days ago. And I tuned out Keanu's accent. And once I did that, I was kind of okay with things. It does seem to be the first thing that's mentioned when people talk about this film. And I think that's unfortunate because there's a lot else there. There's a magnificent scene at the start where you get the backstory of Dracula and how he becomes a vampire and the tragedy that causes him to become a vampire. And Coppola does some interesting things, some of which were borrowed from people like Kurosawa. The battle scenes between the Transylvanians and the Turks are done in silhouette against a red background. And I think that works really well. There's a magnificent suit of armour that Dracula wears, which is now on display at Francis Ford Coppola's winery in the Napa Valley. And you get Gary Oldman as Dracula, really giving it both barrels as Dracula. His Dracula is a primal force of nature warrior at the start of this film. And the weirdest interesting thing about it is that after his wife commits suicide and the priest tells him she can't be buried in consecrated ground, when he stabs the crucifix in the church and blood runs out of it. The twist here is that God created Dracula. It's not the devil. It's actually God being cheesed off because Dracula desecrated one of the churches. And I like that. It takes us back to a certain Old Testament view of God as, you know, a kick-ass kind of deity. Then, of course, we move on to the 19th century, and Jonathan Harker is sent to basically finalise some real estate deals for Dracula. The previous lawyer sent, Renfield, is played by none other than Tom Waits, which for me is genius casting. I think Tom Waits has always been underrated as an actor. He really is one of those guys who's talented in so many ways, of course. Singer, songwriter, actor, crazily good voice for any type of movie you want to put an old codger in. I like Tom Waits in this because I think he does well. His accent too is slightly on the sketchy side, but I think that he sells it a lot better than Keanu does. And his Renfield eating mealworms and other things in an asylum is one of the highlights of the movie. Then you get Anthony Hopkins playing Van Helsing.
Blood and the diseases of the blood, such as syphilis, that concern us here. The very name venereal diseases, the diseases of Venus, imputes to them divine origin.
And this is just after Hopkins won the Academy Award for playing Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And his Van Helsing can only be described as weird. He is an over-the-top guy who knows vampires exist, knows that evil exists. He is really a total nutcase. He will get the job done, but he's dangerous to be around. And then, of course, they keep in the three supporting male characters. Jack Seward, the Doctor, played by Richard E. Grant, which again is fantastic casting. You get Quincy Morris, the Texan, played by Bill Campbell, who later turned up, I think later or maybe earlier, turned up in The Rocketeer, playing Cliff Secord in that. And then we get Arthur Holmwood, played by Kerry Elwes. And none of those three guys get a lot of oxygen in this movie. The main axes are around Sadie Frost's character, Lucy Westenra, and her arc going from charming aristocratic marriage prospect to the slave of Dracula. She has a nice arc in this one. And one of the things people forget about this movie, and I don't know whether they do deliberately or not, is that it's a very sensuous film as well. The scenes with Jonathan Harker being seduced by the three brides of Dracula, one of whom is played by Monica Bellucci, is very sensual. And also Lucy's kind of arc has a lot of sensuality about it. And also we get the young Dracula who turns up in London and slowly seduces Mina. That Dracula is kind of sexy as well, and challenges the kind of Victorian era outlook on female sexuality. In fact, the whole movie does that. Right at the start, you see Mina and Lucy looking at some quite pornographic pictures in a hardcover version of Richard Francis Burton's Arabian Nights. Apparently that prop disappeared from the set for some reason. And the movie has such a great visual style. The use of shadows, the use of misdirection, Dracula moving out of the left-hand side of the screen and appearing a moment later on the right-hand side. There are so many good in-camera tricks used to tell the story in this one. Yeah, they draw attention to themselves, but they draw attention to themselves in service of the story. Coppola was willing to be incredibly playful with the way he made this film. Now, I've got a really nice Blu-ray version of it. This was released by Sony with a whole bunch of extras. There's the cover on that. That's the outside cover. I'm not turning this into a movie haul, by the way. And there's quite a classy inside cover. And this has a lot of extras in it. I'm surprised how much I liked this movie. I don't recall liking it anywhere near as much when it first came out, because I'm not sure I was ready for it. I'm not sure I was ready for the over-the-top outre direction and set designs and production designs and costume designs and special effects designs that we get in this one. Greg Cannon also does a fantastic job with the makeup. The old Dracula makeup is fantastic. The young Dracula makeup is fantastic. The Dracula as half bat makeup is great. And there are also some really outrageous scenes, for instance, when Dracula fades backwards into the shadows with his red glaring eyes, and then Van Helsing holds up a torch and he's turned into a writhing stack of rats. Really lovely bit of work there, and done as practical special effects rather than as computer generated, and I like that a lot. It has a very distinct visual style, even though there are parts of it that Coppola fully admitted were borrowed from earlier vampire movies, including Nosferatu and Dreya's Vampire. There's a little bit of the 1931 in there, a couple of lines of dialogue. Children of the Night is in there. And also, some moments of it have a feel of Mario Bava's Black Sunday and also Black Sabbath. So, and of course, there's just a little soupçon of Hammer in there as well. But somebody like Coppola is the level of craftsman who can put that together in a way and not offend anybody. You can acknowledge the homages in there without thinking he was ripping them off. People don't necessarily like the double bun old Dracula look, but I'm sure they would have done some research, and at some stage it may well have been period accurate. I'm not sure which period, but I'm not even going to bother trying because I don't want to turn this into a movie hairstyle channel. Well, if you're going to talk about the history of Dracula in cinema, you have to talk about this movie. Taking us back to the 1897 version gave us a really interesting take on a character that, when the movie was made, was already thought to be kind of tapped out in cinema. Yeah, they were making Dracula and vampire movies, but they were all guys in evening dress and capes with widow's peaks and red lips, and Coppola didn't go there, and I respect him a lot for that. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can also donate to the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. Going to be back with a couple of other things. I did a bit of a trip up into the hills next to Melbourne and picked up some really nice DVDs and don't get any Blu-rays? No, just DVDs at some charity stores, and I want to talk about some of those movies in the future. I also got another haul from Umbrella Entertainment with a couple of movies that, again, one of them's horror, one of them's a drama, one of them's exploitation, one of them isn't, that are really extreme, and I'm going to be reviewing those ones as well. So anyway, until next time, look after yourselves, stay safe, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, get yourself a few Dracula movies and just sink your teeth into those, and I'll catch you next time.